There is a moment that changes everything. Not the grand, thunderous kind of moment. Not the moment when kingdoms fall or wars are declared. The moment I mean is smaller than that, quieter than that, and somehow far more dangerous. It happens in a corridor lit by firelight, where the shadows move like living things against old stone walls. It happens after a night of fear, after blood on the floor and a hand that reached for her in the dark. It happens when the most powerful alpha in existence, a man who has not spoken softly to another person in 300 years, looks at the woman standing before him and says something he has never said to anyone. He says,
"Any alpha would be lucky to have you."
And she, bruised, exhausted, heart cracked open in ways she can't explain, looks up at him, really looks. Not at the crown he doesn't wear, but everyone sees anyway. Not at the power radiating from him like heat from a forge. She looks at the crack in his voice, the thing he couldn't quite hide. And she whispers,
"I was hoping it would be you."
He goes absolutely still. And in that silence, 300 years of walls begin, very quietly, to come down. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before that moment, there was a woman who had spent her entire life being told she wasn't enough. Before that corridor, before that firelight, before that whisper that would eventually change every law she had been forced to live under. There was a girl who stood in a ceremony circle at 18 years old, while a male wolf looked her in the eye and said she wasn't worth claiming. And every room she'd walked into since then, she'd walked into small. Her name was Seraphine Alden. She went by Sarah. She was 26 years old, a healer of extraordinary quiet skill, and she had learned to make herself invisible in a world that punished wolves who were different. She had no idea what she was, and the Alpha King had known for months. This is their story, and it does not begin gently. Chapter 1. The Summons. The notice came on a Tuesday morning, slipped under her door while she was still bandaging the split knuckles of a pack warrior who had lost a sparring match and didn't want to admit it. By order of the Alpha King, Kale Ashvan, all designated healers of the Ironwood Pack are required to present themselves at the Great Hall by sundown for the duration of the Autumn Council. Syrah read it twice. Then she read it again. The Autumn Council, held every 10 years at a rotating pack seat, it brought together the 12 pack alphas of the Northern Territories under the authority of the Alpha King himself. It had not been held at Ironwood in 30 years. That Kailash Vane had chosen this territory, this pack, this hall, was already the subject of nervous conversation in every corridor she'd walked through that morning. The warrior on her table, a broad-shouldered male named Dex, let out a low whistle when he saw what she was holding. "You're one of the 5 healers on the list, yeah?" "Apparently." "Rough?" She looked at him. "It's a council gathering, Dex, not a war." "It's the Alpha King," he said, as if that explained everything. And for most of Ironwood Pack, it did. Syrah had heard the stories the same as everyone else. Kailash Vane had been Alpha King for 3 centuries, and no one alive had ever challenged him and survived. He had ended 2 wars before they started and 1 after. He had dissolved the Ravenfall Pack for treason so completely that their territory still smelled like his judgment 20 years later. He was said to be cold the way stone is cold, not because warmth was absent, but because something inside him had simply turned to rock long ago. She finished bandaging Dex's hand, told him to keep it clean, and went to find her best uniform, which, as it turned out, had been given to someone else. She found this out when she arrived at the staging area near the Great Hall and saw Lena Voss wearing it. Lena Voss, who was not a healer, who was the Beta's daughter, and who had been assigned as a ceremonial attendant for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the fact that her father wanted her visible to powerful alphas. Lena looked at Syrah with the particular smile of a woman who has just won something small and means to enjoy it. "Oh, were you looking for this?" Lena smoothed the embroidered collar. There must have been some confusion with the linen assignments. There was no confusion. Sarah had been wearing that uniform for 3 years. "It's fine," Sarah said quietly, because it was what she always said, because the alternative was a conflict she couldn't win and a humiliation she couldn't afford. She was given a plain gray shift instead, the kind worn by pack servants. She pinned her healer's badge to it and told herself it didn't matter. It did matter. It always did. But she had learned, over many years, to keep that particular kind of hurt somewhere very small and very far from her face. The great hall had been transformed. Long tables of dark wood gleamed under the light of 100 iron lanterns. The 12 alphas and their delegations would arrive throughout the evening, with the Alpha King coming last. Sarah was stationed near the eastern corridor with 2 other healers, Joss, who was young and nervous, and Elder Karis, who was old enough that nothing impressed her anymore. "Healer placement 3, Elder Karis murmured to Sarah, glancing at her plain uniform without judgment. "Eastern access. We keep out of sight unless called. We do not approach any Alpha or their delegation without permission." "I know the protocol," Sarah said. "I know you do." The elder pressed her hand briefly. "I also know what they did to your uniform. You still look like exactly what you are, child. Don't let them make you forget it." Sarah nodded. She kept her spine straight. The Alphas arrived in order of territorial ranking. Each one was powerful. She could feel it. That animal awareness that all wolves carried. The instinctive recognition of dominance. Some were openly imposing, surrounded by enforcers and trailing power like smoke. Others were quieter, more contained, which in her experience was usually more dangerous. Alpha Rogan of Ironwood arrived last among the regional alphas, moving through the hall with the self-satisfaction of a man hosting a party in his own home. He was blond, broad-shouldered, and had the particular charm of someone who had never once been told no. He saw Sarah near the corridor wall, and his smile didn't change, but his eyes did, a small flicker of something she had never quite been able to name. Not attraction, not contempt, something more calculating than either. She had always made Rogan uneasy. She didn't know why. She didn't have time to think about it, because at exactly the hour the fire in the hearth burned highest, the great doors at the front of the hall opened and the room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of courtesy, the animal quiet of instinct. The quiet that happens when something at the top of every hierarchy in the room enters it. Kale Ashvane did not look like she expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something theatrical, perhaps. Something that announced itself. He was tall, very tall, with the lean, defined build of a wolf who had been fighting for centuries and never stopped. His hair was dark, longer than current fashion, pushed back from a face that was severe and striking in the way that stone carvings in old temples are severe and striking. Features meant for lasting, not for softness. He wore dark clothing with no adornment except a single ring on his right hand, so old the metal had grown nearly black. His eyes, when the firelight caught them, were the color of amber and shadow mixed together. He walked into the room, and the 12 alphas, including Rogan, who was in his own territory, all shifted slightly. Their bodies simply reoriented, the way compass needles find north. They didn't bow, but they all moved differently when he was present, as if the room itself had reorganized its priorities. He didn't seem to notice. Or perhaps he noticed and simply didn't care. He took his seat at the head of the council table, and the room exhaled. Sarah exhaled with it, then pressed herself slightly further back against the corridor wall and reminded herself she was there to be useful and invisible in equal measure. She managed to maintain that invisibility for approximately 40 minutes. It ended because of an alpha named Breck from the Northern Coast Pack, who had drunk considerably more than his fair share of the ceremonial wine and who had apparently decided that the evening called for something other than political discussion. He crossed the eastern corridor during a brief recess, walked up to Sarah, and placed his hand on her arm with the easy presumption of a man who had never once considered that a woman might not want him to. "Back, healer," he said, giving the words the tone of an endearment. "Come and sit with my delegation. We could use someone like you close at hand." His grip was firm. The kind of firm that was a statement, not an accident. "I'm stationed here," Sarah said evenly. "Protocol requires—" "Protocol," he said, smiling, "is what happens when people can't think of a better idea." He began to pull her arm, gently but unmistakably, toward the main hall. She planted her feet. She said, quietly and clearly, "Let go of my arm, please." He laughed. Other wolves nearby glanced over. She saw it in her peripheral vision, that particular male curiosity about whether she would cause a scene, whether she would make it embarrassing for everyone, whether she understood her place. She did not cause a scene. She held still, kept her voice calm, and repeated herself. And then the laughter in the room stopped. Not because of her. Because of the silence that had fallen from the direction of the head table, radiating outward like cold air from an opened window. Sarah felt it on the back of her neck before she understood what it was. Cale Ashvane was looking at Alpha Breck. He hadn't stood up. He hadn't spoken. He was simply looking, with the particular focused attention of a predator who has decided something. And the quality of that attention, the absolute, unyielding certainty of it, made Alpha Breck's hand fall from Sarah's arm as if the bones had gone out of his fingers. A moment of breathless silence. Then Cale spoke. His voice was low and unhurried, and carried to every corner of the room the way deep sounds carry, not because of volume, but because of weight. "Breck, that was all. Just the name." Alpha Breck turned, straightened, and muttered something that was either an apology or an excuse. He returned to his delegation without looking at Sarah again. Sarah stood very still for a moment, heart beating somewhere between her ribs and her throat. Then she looked toward the head table because she couldn't not. Cale was not looking at her. He had already returned his attention to the documents before him, as if the interruption had been merely an administrative matter now resolved. But a few minutes later, when she thought she was safely watching from the corridor wall, she looked up and found his eyes across the room, amber and shadow, utterly unreadable, resting on her face with a stillness that felt like the center of something very deep. He looked away first. Her pulse didn't settle for a long time after that. She told herself it was just the weight of authority, the natural response of any wolf to the presence of the highest dominance in the territory. She almost believed it. 2 hours later, she was brought a new assignment. One of the Alpha King's senior commanders, a wolf named Heron, had arrived with a wound in his side that had been improperly dressed during the journey, a sparring injury that had reopened, gone untreated, and was now showing early signs of infection. He needed a skilled healer immediately. She was the senior healer on the evening shift. She was escorted to the guest quarters in the northern wing. It was only when she had cleaned, treated, and dressed Heron's wound with quiet competence and turned to leave that she realized the doorway was occupied. Cale Ashvane leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her work the same way he had been watching her across the great hall, with that absolute, contained attention that felt like being examined by something ancient and unnervingly perceptive. "It'll be fine," she said, because she was a healer, and that was the information that mattered. The infection was early. He needs to rest the side for 3 days and not reopen the stitching. "I know he'll be fine," Cale said. "I chose you specifically because I knew he would be." She blinked. "You chose me?" "There are 5 healers on the rotation." "I know." He didn't elaborate. She should have left. The corridor was right there. The night was long. And standing in a room with the Alpha King, while his injured commander dozed behind her, and the fire burned. Down was not something her standing in Ironwood Pack could afford to complicate. She knew that with every logical part of her. She said, "Thank you." For earlier, in the hall, he was quiet for a moment. Breck is a fool who misunderstands the word protocol. You shouldn't have been put in that position. I handle situations like that myself, usually. Something shifted in his expression. Too quick to name. I'm sure you do. She nodded, picked up her healer's kit, and moved toward the door. Seraphine, she stopped. He had used her full name. She hadn't told him her name. You're reassigned for the duration of the council, he said. As of tonight, you attend to this delegation. Heron will need daily monitoring, and I have several senior wolves who could use skilled attention after a long journey. He paused. You'll be given quarters on this floor. Your belongings will be moved. That's... She stopped herself. She had been about to say that's not necessary. She looked at him instead and saw something in the set of his jaw that made her choose different words. That's generous. It's practical, he said. And he stepped aside to let her pass and didn't look at her as she went. And she walked down the corridor with her kit in both hands and her heartbeat making an argument she wasn't ready to hear. Behind her, the door closed very softly, as if he had closed it himself, and stood there for a moment with his hand on the wood. She told herself she didn't notice. That night, Elder Karras stopped her in the hall outside the new room that had been prepared for her. The old healer looked at her for a long moment, with dark eyes that had seen a great many things, and then said, "Be careful, child. I'm just attending his delegation." "I know what you're doing," Karras said. "That's not what I mean." She paused. "He's been watching you since he arrived. I've been doing this long enough to know when an Alpha King watches a woman like that, it is never as simple as he believes it is." Syrah shook her head. "Elder Karras, I'm not warning you away from him," the old woman said quietly. "I'm warning you about yourself, about what you might feel and what it might cost, and whether you're strong enough to carry it if it goes wrong." She touched Sarah's cheek once, briefly. "I think you are. I just want you to go in with your eyes open." Syrah stood in the hall long after Elder Karras had gone. She was going in with her eyes wide open. She only wasn't sure what she was looking at yet. Chapter 2. The King's Healer, the next morning, arrived cold and pale, and Syrah arrived at Heron's room before sunrise to check his side. He was already awake, sitting at the edge of his cot with the patient, resigned expression of a soldier who had spent a lifetime being told to rest by people smaller than him. He was enormous, tall as a door and nearly as wide, but he submitted to her examination with complete and unself-conscious cooperation, which told her something about the company he kept. Man who worked closely with Kale Ashvane apparently learned not to waste energy on performance. "Clean," she told him, re-bandaging the wound with efficient hands. "No spreading redness. You'll be sore for a week. The stitches come out in 12 days. I told him it wasn't serious," Heron said. "He was right to disagree with you." She clipped the last bandage fold. "Wolves heal faster than humans, but infected wounds still kill you, given enough time." Heron looked at her with an evaluating expression that had nothing to do with medicine. "You're the one from last night. I'm the healer attending your delegation." "That's not what I mean." He settled his shirt back over the dressing. He doesn't usually get involved with other alphas' behaviors. As long as nothing violates a law, it's not his business. He paused. He got up from the table. "He didn't stand up," Syrah said. "No, but he was going to. I've served him for 40 years. I know the difference between him sitting still and him being still." Heron looked at her steadily. "I thought you should know that." She gathered her kit and didn't answer. She saw Kale an hour later when he came to check on Heron before the morning council session. He came in without ceremony, asked Heron 2 direct questions about his condition. listened to Sarah's medical summary with an attentiveness that she noticed with some surprise. He didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss anything she said, and asked one specific follow-up question about the infection timeline that told her he had some actual medical knowledge. "You've treated field wounds before," she said, without thinking. He looked at her. "I have. On yourself?" "On my soldiers." When the nearest healer was 3 days, ride and waiting wasn't an option. Something moved across his face briefly. Not pride, not something she could name easily. A memory, maybe. "You learn what you can when lives depend on it." She nodded. She understood that logic more than he knew. They were the only people in the room. Heron had excused himself to the adjacent washroom. The fire was burning, and the morning light was the thin blue-gray kind that made everything look simultaneously very clear and very fragile. "I want to ask you something," she said, before she quite decided to say it. He waited. That was one of the things about him that she was already beginning to feel underneath her skin. The way he gave silence like a gift. He didn't fill it or redirect it. He simply offered it and let her use it however she needed to. "Why me, specifically?" She met his eyes steadily. "There are 2 healers in this pack more senior than I am. There are 3 from visiting delegations who have greater ceremonial status. I'm not the most qualified by rank. So why?" He studied her for a moment. When he answered, his voice was the careful, measured kind that meant something was being chosen and something else was being set aside. "Because last night, when Brett grabbed your arm, you didn't cry. You didn't rage. You set your feet and you repeated yourself, calmly and clearly, twice." He paused. "And when I intervened, you didn't look relieved that someone had rescued you. You looked like you were mildly annoyed that you hadn't been allowed to finish handling it yourself." The faintest suggestion of something moved across his mouth. "I want someone in this delegation who handles things themselves. Not someone who performs competence because they're standing next to me." She stood very still. "Also," he said, quieter, "the work you did on Heron's wound last night was excellent. The infection was further along than it looked. A less precise healer would have missed a secondary contamination in the tissue beneath the surface. You didn't miss it. She should have accepted that as professional assessment and moved on. Instead, she said, you watched me closely enough to assess my technique? I watch everything closely, he said. And then he picked up his documents from the side table and walked to the door and paused with his hand on the frame and said, over his shoulder, join the delegation for breakfast. You shouldn't be eating with the general staff if you're working this floor. He left. She stood in the warm, quiet room for a moment, listening to the fire. She thought, this is going to cost me something. She thought, I don't know if I mind. It was in the afternoon of that second day that she met Myra. Myra was old. Not elder old, not the respectable 60 or 70 that some wolves reached with silver in their hair and dignity in their bearing. Myra was ancient in the way that stones in riverbeds are ancient, worn smooth by time, unchanged in their fundamental nature, unbothered by the current moving around them. She had white hair pinned in a complex arrangement and eyes the color of winter sky, and she was sitting in a chair in the corridor outside the council chamber as if she had been placed there specifically to be encountered. You are the healer from Ironwood, Myra said, when Syrah passed her. I am. Syrah slowed. And you are? Old enough that you shouldn't need to ask, and experienced enough that you shouldn't be surprised by what I'm going to tell you. Myra tilted her head and looked at Syrah with the winter sky eyes and didn't blink. Come here, child. Let me look at your hands. It was such an odd request that Syrah obeyed it, extending both hands palms up. Myra took Syrah's wrists in both of hers. Her fingers were warm and strong and looked at the palms for a long time. Syrah felt nothing and then felt something. a faint, very faint warmth building in her own hands, like sunlight focused through glass. It wasn't pain. It wasn't entirely comfortable. It was something between the two, pressing gently at the insides of her fingers. Then Myra let go. She looked at Sarah's face with an expression that Sarah could not interpret at all. It was too complex, too layered. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been grief or relief or both of them braided together. "Oh," Myra said softly, very softly. "It's you. What does that mean?" "It means," Myra said carefully, "that you have been living your entire life in a room with the shutters closed, and you have never once wondered why the light inside looks different from the light outside." She released Sarah's wrists. "It means your healer's gift is not what they told you it was." She paused. "It means that you should be careful and brave, and perhaps most importantly, you should stop making yourself small in rooms where you are the most extraordinary thing present." Sarah pulled her hands back slowly. "I don't know what you're telling me." "Not yet," Myra agreed. "But you will." The old woman settled back in her chair and picked up the book that had been resting in her lap, as if the conversation were simply finished. "You should go. He'll be looking for you soon. He does that." A small, ancient smile. "Even when he's pretending not to." Sarah stood in the corridor for another moment, then walked on. That evening, changing the dressings on a minor laceration for one of the Alpha King's younger soldiers, she noticed that when her hands passed over the wound, not touching it, just near it, the red edges of inflammation seemed to ease. Slightly, perhaps barely measurably. She had always thought it was warmth. Body heat from proximity. For the first time in 26 years, she wondered if it was something else. Chapter 3. Walls and Wolves. By the fourth day of the council, she had stopped counting the number of times she caught him watching her. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the consuming, obvious stare that stories described. It was simpler and somehow more unnerving than that, a quality of attention that she kept finding whenever she happened to look up. As if his eyes had been there long enough to settle in. He never acknowledged it when she caught him. He would simply shift his gaze to something else with the unhurried ease of a person who doesn't feel the need to explain himself. And she would look down at her kit, or back at her patient, or at the fire, and pretend she hadn't noticed the way her heartbeat did something irregular every single time. They talked. That was the part she hadn't expected. Not medically. She had expected medical conversation. She was comfortable with medical conversation. But they talked about other things, in the stolen minutes between his sessions and her rounds, in the warm corridor outside the council chamber, in the odd quiet that sometimes settled over the northern wing in the middle of the day when the Alphas were in formal session and the floor was briefly, blessedly empty. He asked her about Ironwood. Not the politics of it. He knew the politics. He asked about the forest itself, the trails she knew, the way the trees changed in autumn, whether the river that ran along the eastern edge was as fast in fall as it was in spring. He asked with the particular attention of someone who had been in too many places for too short a time, and had never gotten to simply know one. She told him about the river. She told him about the trail that wound up behind the healer's cottage to a clearing where you could see both the forest canopy and the mountains in the same glance, on clear days, and how she went there when she needed to think. She told him about the smell of the packed territory after rain, that specific combination of wet pine and dark earth that she had loved since childhood and could still find her way home by in total darkness. He listened to all of it with his full, uninterrupted attention, and then said, quietly, "Tell me what the rain smells like." She looked at him. "You've been everywhere. You know what rain smells like." "I know what rain smells like in 100 places," he said. "Tell me what it smells like here." She did. He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened them and was the Alpha King again, composed and unreachable, and said something about needing to review the afternoon's agenda documents. But for those 3 seconds, she had seen something in his face that had nothing to do with councils or crowns or 300 years of carefully managed authority. She had seen a person who was very, very tired of not having a home. On the 5th evening, she noticed his hands. She had been watching him review documents at the table in the outer chamber. He had not objected to her working in the same space. While she prepared the evening's medical supplies, and she saw it, the way his right hand pressed briefly to his chest, just below the sternum. A small gesture. The kind that has been made so many times it has stopped being conscious. He did it twice in the space of an hour. The second time, she asked, "Does your chest hurt?" He went very still. "No, that's where you keep pressing your hand." He looked at her with those amber and shadow eyes and said nothing for a moment that stretched long enough to carry weight. "Old habit," he said finally. She knew it wasn't. She knew the physiology of mate bonds. Every healer did. She knew that the pull of a true mate created a specific physical sensation, described differently by every wolf, but always centered in the chest, directly over the heart. She knew that suppressing a mate bond, fighting it, refusing it, denying its existence, created a chronic, low-grade ache in exactly that location. She also knew that telling him what she suspected would be the most dangerous thing she had ever said out loud. "I had a mate claim ceremony once," she said instead. She didn't look at him. She kept her hands busy with the supply preparation. When I was 18. His name was Davin. He was chosen for me by my father, who wanted to strengthen the pack's bloodline with the Voss family. Cale had gone very quiet in that particular way that meant he was listening with everything. "He stood in the ceremony circle," she continued, "and he looked at me for a long time. And then he said, in front of the whole pack, in front of my father, in front of everyone, that he didn't sense a bond with me, that I felt like a half-shifted wolf to him, incomplete." She set down the bandage roll. "He said he wasn't going to chain himself to something that wasn't whole." The silence in the room had a different quality now. She turned and found Cale looking at her with an expression that was almost frightening in its directness, not with pity, which she could not have borne, and not with anger, though anger was there, but with a kind of recognition, as if the words "wasn't whole" had landed somewhere in him that already knew that exact particular wound. "He was wrong," Cale said. The words were short and absolute, the way only true things can be. "I know that now," she said. "I didn't then. He was a fool and a coward," Cale said, quieter. "And he did not deserve to stand in that circle with you." She studied him. "Why does it matter to you?" He looked away. The muscle in his jaw worked. He said, "It doesn't." "It does," she said softly, not accusing him, just naming what was in the room. He stood up, crossed to the window, stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the darkening courtyard, and then said, without turning, "I haven't taken a mate in 300 years. She waited. "There are reasons," he said. "They are not small reasons. I'm not asking you for anything," she said carefully. "I was just telling you something true about myself, because you've been kind to me, in ways that cost you nothing and meant a great deal. I thought you deserved something real in return." He turned his head, just enough to see her in his peripheral vision. The firelight caught his profile and made him look ancient and achingly human at the same time. "You deserve more than you've been given in this pack," he said. "Most people deserve more than they're given," she said. "That's not particular to me." He made a sound that might, under other circumstances, and from a different man, have been called a laugh. She found that she was smiling. That was the night she woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of quiet movement in the outer corridor, went to her door, and saw Cale Ashvane standing at the end of the hall near the window, in the dark, very still. Just standing there, looking at the courtyard. She watched him for 3 breaths. Then she went back to bed and lay in the dark for a long time, and thought about a man who pressed his hand to his chest when he thought no one was looking, and who had not let himself have a home in 300 years. And in the morning, she told herself it wasn't her place to do anything about that. In the morning, someone tried to kill her. She was coming back from an early walk to the herb stores. She had gone alone, which in retrospect she would understand was exactly what they had counted on when a wolf she didn't recognize stepped out of the shadow of the east wall and hit her hard enough to slam her into the stone. It was not random. She understood that immediately, even through the shock of impact and the pain spiking up her shoulder. It was precise, targeted, and the wolf who had done it was already gone, lost in the pale early light between one stone archway and the next. Before she had fully registered what had happened, she sat against the wall for a moment. Her hands, pressed to the ground, felt something warm move through them. That same warmth she'd been noticing, stronger now, pulsing, strange, misplaced. Then she stood up, straightened her clothing, and went to find Kale. She found him before she had to look very far, because he had apparently already been coming to find her. He came around the corner of the corridor at something just short of a run, and stopped when he saw her, and in the span of the single second between seeing her and composing himself, she saw something cross his face that she would think about for a very long time afterward. It was fear. Specific, personal, shattering fear. The kind that is not about duty or strategy or geopolitical consequence. The kind that is only about one person. He was at her side in 3 steps. His hands came up to her face and stopped before touching her, a visible effort, the muscles of his arms actually tightening with the restraint of it. He assessed her the way she assessed wounds, rapidly, systematically, without apparent emotion, and with every concealed emotion focused entirely on the work. "What happened?" he said. Not a question, a command. She told him. He listened without moving. When she finished, he said, "Which direction?" "East archway." They were gone immediately. I didn't get a scent. The wind was wrong. He turned toward the archway. His hands were closed at his sides. She could see from the stillness of him that something very controlled was happening just underneath the surface. The effort of a wolf who has spent 3 centuries learning to govern his own power, being required to govern it in this specific moment. Kale. She used his name without thinking. She had never used it before. He turned back to her, and the thing on his face when she said his name, that particular unguarded flash, was the most dangerous thing she had seen in the 5 days she'd known him. "Someone sent them," she said. "This was not random. I need you to tell me if this is connected to something I should know about." A pause. Measured. Painful. To watch. "Not here," he said. "Come with me." She went with him. Chapter 4. The words that changed everything. He took her to a room she hadn't seen, a private study off the main council chambers, lined floor to ceiling with old books that had been placed there by whoever had set up the Alpha King's quarters and who had apparently known what he preferred. He closed the door. He stood with his back against it for a moment. "The attack may be politically motivated," he said. "You are the senior healer assigned to my delegation. Targeting my staff is a way of sending a message to you. Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Or it's a message about me specifically." The quiet he gave her then was the kind that confirms rather than denies. "Tell me," she said. "There are those who have reason to want me. Destabilized," he said. "Uncertain. Distracted." He paused. "I have not had personal ties to any one pack in many years. My neutrality has been strategically useful to me and threatening to those who would prefer I had vulnerabilities they could use. And my presence in your delegation represents a vulnerability." He was very still. "Because you've been visible in your attention toward me," she said, slowly, carefully, because she needed to understand what she was walking into. Enough that someone noticed. Enough that they decided that targeting me might affect you. He said nothing. Kale, she said, you have to tell me what I am to you. Not the official reason, not the delegation assignment. What I am. The silence in the room was enormous. Ben, I've known you were my mate since the Spring Council 6 months ago, when you attended as a representative of the Regional Healers Guild. His voice was steady. His eyes were not quite meeting hers, which on his face was equivalent to falling apart. You walked into the assembly room, and I lost the ability to think about anything that wasn't the fact that you were there. She sat down. Her legs made the decision without consulting her. I arranged to have you assigned to my delegation, he continued. Not because I intended anything, but because I could not spend 10 days in the same territory, knowing you were in a servant's uniform while Rogan Voss used you as furniture. He paused. I told myself it was protective, pragmatic, a matter of duty. And now? Now someone has put their hands on you, he said, very quietly, and I am standing here having a very honest conversation with myself about what my next action should be. She looked at him. At the 300 years and the locked-up loneliness and the hand he kept pressing to his chest in the dark. Why haven't you claimed me? She asked. Not with anger. With the same steadiness she used for hard diagnoses. He sat down then, heavily, as if something had gone out of the perfect posture of him. He leaned forward with his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor. There is a prophecy, he said. Old, from the time of the first Alpha Kings. The king who loves will watch love die, until the healer's hand breaks the lie. He paused. My chosen mate, the woman I loved in my 2nd century, before I had my crown, she was killed. 3 months after we declared our bond. By enemies who saw her as a way to reach me. She said nothing. She waited. I decided then, he said, that it was not possible for me to have this. That what I am, what I carry, the enemies I've accumulated across centuries, it made love an act of cruelty. Something I could want, but never give, because giving it to someone meant painting a target on them. So you've been alone for 300 years. I've been careful for 300 years, he said. Alone is not. He stopped. Yes, alone. The fire burned. The room was warm. Outside, the morning council session was probably beginning, and 12 alphas were assembling in the Great Hall, and none of that was the most important thing happening anywhere. I have a confession, too, she said. He looked up. She looked down at her own hands. My Wolf, they told me my whole life that I was incomplete, that I had a partial shift, that my Wolf was too quiet, too small, not strong enough. That's why Davin rejected me. That's why my father considered me a disappointment. She paused. But it's not quite true, is it? Because Myra looked at my hands yesterday and said something about shutters being closed and light being different inside. She looked up at him. And last night when I walked in the herbs garden, something in my hands felt like, I can't describe it, like a second heartbeat. Like something trying to surface. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Careful, wondering, afraid of what he might be hoping for. I don't know what I am, she said. I have never had anyone tell me the truth of what I am. He stood up. He crossed to where she was sitting and crouched down in front of her, bringing himself to her eye level, and looked at her with those amber eyes that had spent 300 years seeing everything and admitting nothing. I'm going to tell you something, he said, and I need you to understand that if I'm right, and Myra believes I am, it means that everything you were told about your inadequacy was a deliberate lie, told by people who were afraid of you. She held very still. Wolves with the silver bloodline appear once every few generations, he said. Their shift is different, smaller in form, but their power is not combat power. It's something older. He paused. A silver wolf can heal wounds that should be fatal. They can reveal truth in the presence of deception. They can, under some circumstances, break bonds, curses, old laws written in blood. His voice was very quiet. The last silver wolf was seen 200 years ago. She ended a war by walking into a conflict between two alphas and healing the wound that had started it. She stared at him. Myra has been looking for one her entire life, he said. She believed that the prophecy, the healer's hand breaks the lie, referred to a silver wolf healer. He paused. Sira, the warmth you've been feeling in your hand since you arrived here. It's your wolf trying to emerge. She hasn't been able to before because you've been in an environment that kept you in a state of threat and shame. You can't fully shift when you don't feel safe enough to be real. The room was absolutely silent. You're saying, she said, slowly, that the thing they used against me all my life, my quiet wolf, my incomplete shift, was actually proof of something extraordinary. And someone knew that. His jaw tightened. Yes, and you think they kept it from me deliberately? I think, he said, very carefully, that Rogan Voss has known about your bloodline for some time. I think he is the reason Davin rejected you publicly. I think he has been actively suppressing your sense of safety in this pack for years to prevent you from coming into your power. He paused. And I think this morning's attack was him escalating, because you're here, safe, close to me, and your wolf is starting to wake up. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, quietly, any alpha would be lucky to have me. That's what you said last week, when Breck's second officer made the comment at the table about pack healers being decorative. He blinked. He had almost forgotten he'd said it. You meant it as a general statement, she said, about my worth. I meant it, he said, as something I did not trust myself to make specific. She held his gaze. Something in her chest was aching in a way that had nothing to do with the wolf trying to surface. She said, softly, I was hoping it would be you. The words landed in the room like something physical. He went completely still. She watched it happen. The 300 years of walls meeting something they could not simply decide to hold against. She watched his eyes change, the amber in them warming the way coals warm when you blow on them. And for one unguarded, infinite moment, he looked exactly like what he was. A person who had been alone for so long that being wanted had become a language he could no longer read and yet still somehow recognized. He said, You don't know what loving me costs. Tell me, she said. Not the prophecy, the real cost. You could die, he said, and his voice broke on it, just slightly. Just enough. Being bonded to me makes you a target. Every enemy I have, and I have many, would use you, would come for you. I can protect you with enormous resources, but it cannot be everywhere, and I cannot. He stopped, pressed his lips together. I could not survive it again. I know that with complete certainty. If something happened to you because of what you are to me, I would not survive it. She reached out and placed her hand over his, where it rested on his knee. He looked at their hands. Then, we make sure nothing happens to me, she said, starting with whoever Rogan sent this morning. His other hand came over hers, slowly, covering it completely. The council session starts in an hour, he said. I know. We're going to have a very complicated day. I know that too. He didn't let go of her hand. Neither did she. Then the door opened, and Mira stood in the doorway with winter sky eyes and absolute composure and said, You should both come now. Rogan has called an emergency motion before the full council. He's invoking the blood claim. Chapter 5. The blood claim. The Great Hall was already full when they arrived. 12 alphas. Their delegations. The full council staff. Every enforcer. Every senior wolf, every visiting dignitary who had been in the Ironwood Pack territory for the last 5 days. They were all assembled, standing in the long hall under the iron lanterns, and the air was tight with the specific tension of a room where a predator has made a move, and everyone is waiting to see what moves next. Rogan stood at the center. He had dressed carefully, the formal colors of Ironwood Pack, his alpha chain across his chest, the expression of a man who has prepared this moment and is pleased with his preparation. He didn't look at Sierra when she entered. He looked at Kale. That told her everything she needed to know about what this was really about. The blood claim was an ancient law, rarely invoked in the modern era, existing in the Great Council's legal code more as an artifact of old power structures than as any practical governance. She had studied it once in the Healer's Archive, because understanding old laws sometimes helped understand old wounds. It held, simply, any alpha had the right to formally challenge the personal proximity of any individual to the Alpha King if they believed that individual to be of unworthy blood or unfit standing. If the challenge was upheld by council vote, the individual would be removed from the king's court, denied pack protection, and subject to the judgment of their own alpha. It was, in practice, a weapon, a way to isolate a king by removing anyone he valued. Kale took his place at the head of the chamber. He had not spoken to her directly since Myra's interruption, but he had walked beside her the entire way to the hall, close enough that his arm pressed against her shoulder, and that had been its own kind of statement. "Alpha Rogan of Ironwood," Kale said. His voice was the council voice, level, formal, and underneath both of those things, extremely dangerous. "You have called an emergency motion." "I have." Rogan spread his hands in a gesture of regretful duty. "Alpha King, the assembled council has observed, over the past 5 days, a pattern of attention directed by this court toward the Ironwood healer designated Seraphine Alden." He paused for effect. "Attention that exceeds the professional scope of her assignment, and that may indicate a personal bond, or the development of one between her and the Alpha King himself." Silence. "If such a bond is real or developing," Rogan continued, "the council has both the right and the duty to assess whether the individual in question is of sufficient standing to occupy a position of personal proximity to the throne." He met Kale's gaze. "She is a half-shift wolf, Alpha King, incomplete, of no distinguished bloodline. She was rejected in her own claiming ceremony by a wolf of this pack 8 years ago, for exactly this reason." He let that settle before continuing. "I invoke the blood claim in the interest of the Alpha King's protection and the integrity of this court." Sierra stood perfectly still. Around her, she felt the room's response, not hostile, most of it, more like discomfort. The discomfort of people who knew an injustice was being performed and were uncertain whether their position allowed them to object. Several of the other alphas looked at Kale with expressions ranging from sympathy to calculation. Kale's face was stone. "The motion is recorded," he said. "The council will deliberate." "With respect," Rogan said, and the false deference in his voice was visible to everyone. "The law requires that the individual in question be present for the challenge and given the opportunity to respond." "She is present," Kale said. "Then she may speak if she chooses." Rogan finally looked at her, and the thing in his eyes was exactly what she had never been able to name before. She could name it now. It was the look of a man who had always known what she was and had spent years ensuring she never found out. Every person in the room turned toward her. She looked at Rogan. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Myra, standing against the far wall. The old woman gave a very small nod. Sierra held up her hands. She had not planned this. She had not rehearsed it. She simply held up her hands, palms out, in front of the assembled council, and breathed, and let herself stop fighting it. The thing in her chest, the second heartbeat, the warmth she had been telling herself, was just warmth. She stopped explaining it and let it come. The light appeared gradually, silver white, the color of moonlight mixed with morning. It rose from her palms like something breathing, moving up her wrists in thin branching lines the way frost moves across glass. It didn't hurt. It felt for the first time in her life like breathing correctly. The room made a sound, not words. Just the involuntary response of 24 wolves encountering something that their animal instincts recognized even if their logical minds did not. "The silver bloodline," Mira said from the wall. Her voice was quiet and absolute, carrying the specific authority of someone who has been waiting to say something for a very long time. The last seen 200 years past. The gift does not present as combat strength. It does not present as dominance. It presents as truth light, the ability to heal, to reveal, and when necessary. She paused. To break what was falsely bound. The silver light played across Sarah's palms. She didn't try to suppress it or contain it. She just let it exist. Rogan's expression had changed. Underneath the performance, underneath the careful layers of strategic positioning, there was fear. The kind that had been there for a long time, she suspected. The kind that had sent Davin into a ceremony circle 8 years ago. "The challenge stands," Rogan said, and his voice had shifted. Still controlled, but the register was different. "Bloodline or not, the law." "The law requires," Kale said, and every voice in the room stopped, "that I state whether a bond exists or is developing." He paused. Sarah looked at him. "It exists," he said, into the absolute silence of the room. "Serafini Alden is my true mate. The bond was recognized 6 months ago and deliberately suppressed by me, for personal reasons that are no longer sufficient." He let his gaze rest on Rogan for exactly 1 moment. "I claim her." The words landed in the room like a stone in still water. Everything rippled. Rogan said, "Then by the blood claim law, any alpha present may formally challenge her right to stand." "Then challenge me," Kale said. "Not her. Challenge me. I will meet you in the circle if that is the law you want to invoke." He stepped forward. "But I suggest you think carefully about which laws you want to use today. Rogan of Ironwood, because I have been spending the last 48 hours reviewing a great many of them, including the laws concerning the orchestration of attacks against members of the Alpha King's court." The room went very, very quiet. "And," Kale continued, "the laws concerning the deliberate suppression of the Silver Wolf bloodline for personal political gain." He paused. "Would you like to explain to this council, Rogan, how you knew 8 years ago that Serafini carried the silver bloodline? How you arranged for her to be publicly rejected by a wolf of your own, choosing to ensure her sense of safety, and therefore her power remained suppressed? Would you like to tell us why that suppression benefited you specifically?" He tilted his head, very slightly. "Or shall I tell them?" Rogan's composure finally, visibly, cracked. He looked at Sarah with something unmasked now. The fear and the resentment, and under both of them, something almost like desperation. And then he did the most dangerous thing he had done all day. He lunged. Not for Kale, for Sarah. Chapter 6. The Silver Wolf and the King. Everything happened at once. The room erupted. Enforcers moved. Kale moved. A dozen wolves in the hall surged in every direction. And Sarah, who had a fraction of a second between Rogan lunging and Rogan reaching her, made a choice. She did not run. She stepped toward him. She raised her hands, palms out, the silver light blazing full now. Not the gentle warmth of it, but the full, unrestrained truth of what it was. And when Rogan's hands closed on her shoulders, when his wolf strength should have knocked her down, the light met him. It wasn't pain. She needed to understand that, for herself as much as for anyone watching. She was not hurting him. But truth is its own kind of agony when you have spent your life building walls against it. The silver light moved from her palms into him, through his hands, up his arms, and it revealed. It was the only word for what happened next. Revealed. Like light through clouded water, like breath on a cold mirror. The wolves in the room closest to Rogan inhaled sharply. Then others. The sensation was, she would learn later, different for each of them, but unanimous in its effect. They could feel it, a sudden clarity, the way you feel when a headache you didn't know you had finally lifts. The sensation of something that had been obscured becoming visible. What Rogan had done. For how long? For whom? The Silver Wolf's gift was not combat. Myra had said that. But it was not only healing either. It was the ability to make truth inescapable in the presence of those who could receive it. Rogan let go of her. He stumbled back. He looked around the room at the faces of the wolves who had been in Ironwood Pack the longest, his senior betas, his enforcers, his council representative, and he saw the moment they felt it too. The weight of everything he had concealed, lifting into the air around them all. The beta, who had always enforced Rogan's decisions, turned away from him. Then another wolf. Then another. Rogan stood in the center of the room and was, for the first time in his tenure as Alpha, completely alone. Kale was at Sarah's side. He didn't touch her yet. She understood why the silver light was still running. She needed a moment to let it settle. But he stood at her shoulder with a presence that was its own kind of protection. Every wolf in that room understood, in the wordless language of pack instinct, that they would have to go through him to reach her. And that no one in that hall, Rogan included, was capable of that. The blood claim, Kale said, into the silence of the room, is a law written to protect courts from unsuitable influence. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. This council will vote today on two matters. Whether Rogan of Ironwood Pack has violated the laws against the deliberate suppression of a recognized bloodline for political gain, and whether the blood claim law in its current form will continue to exist in our legal code. He looked around the room. Because a law that can be used to target a woman of extraordinary gift, to isolate a king from his true mate, and to punish people for being exactly what their enemies feared, is not a law that protects courts. It is a law that protects corruption. No one spoke against it. Not one alpha. Rogan, it turned out, was removed from his position by a council vote that took less than 20 minutes. His challenge was rejected. His orchestration of the attack on Sarah, confirmed by two of his own betas who spoke clearly under the lingering atmosphere of truth that her power had set loose in the hall, was documented and recorded in full council record. His alpha chain was removed in the Great Hall, and he was escorted from the territory by the Alpha King's own enforcers before sundown. The blood claim law was struck from the code the following morning. Sarah stood in the corridor outside the council chamber when it was over, finally alone for the first time since morning. Her hands were quiet. The silver light had faded back to warmth, the comfortable warmth she'd been living with her whole life and had never understood. She was tired. She was something else too, something she couldn't quite name because she had not had occasion to feel it before in any room she'd ever been in. She felt exactly like herself. Kale found her there. Of course he did. He stopped a few feet away, and they looked at each other in the corridor with the firelight behind them and the sounds of the pack, settling into evening, drifting through the stone walls, and she thought, this is the moment. The one that changes everything. The small one. He crossed the remaining distance. He reached up, and with a care that was precise and deliberate and entirely unlike the unrelenting competence he showed in every other context of his life, cupped her face in both hands. She felt the mate bond then, not the ache of it suppressed, but the real thing, warm and deep and permanent. Like the moment you finally step inside from cold weather and your whole body understands what warmth actually is. You should not have stepped toward him, he said. His voice was not steady. I wasn't going to let you fight him for me, she said. That was mine to do. I know. He pressed his forehead against hers, very lightly. I know. I just Sarah. He said her name differently than anyone had ever said it, like it had weight, like it was something he'd been carrying carefully. You stepped toward him with your hands out, like I was offering something instead of defending against it, she said, because that's how the gift works. I couldn't have planned it. I just knew. You terrified me, he said. You were extraordinary, and you terrified me. She smiled and felt it in her chest where the bond was. You've been terrified of me since the Spring Council. A breath. Yes. And you arranged to keep me near you anyway. Yes. That seems significant, she said. For a man who insists he cannot afford attachment. He pulled back just enough to look at her. The amber in his eyes was fully warm now, not the careful, managed warmth he allowed himself in public, but the real kind, the kind that had been under everything all along. I was wrong, he said, about the prophecy. I spent 3 centuries reading it as a warning against love. The king who loves will watch love die. He paused, but the second half, until the healer's hand breaks the lie. I thought it meant that love would eventually destroy me. He looked at her hands, her quiet, silver-warm, extraordinary hands. I think what it actually meant is that love has been lying to me. Every way I've understood love has been wrong. Too small, too afraid, too much about losing to be about anything else. He turned her hands over in his gently, and it took a healer's hand to break that lie. She looked at him for a long moment. 300 years, she said. You've been alone for 300 years. Yes, that's a very long time to have been wrong about something. The suggestion of a smile crossed his mouth. Real, rare, entirely his. It is. You have a lot of making up to do. I'm aware. She leaned up and pressed her lips to his. Briefly, softly, just enough to be a beginning. He held still for one breath, as if he was afraid to move and break something. Then his hand settled at her waist, careful and certain at once, and he kissed her back with the accumulated tenderness of 3 centuries of a person who had believed he couldn't. When they broke apart, the corridor was quiet and warm, and she was smiling against his jaw. Your pack, she said. Your council. Your enemies. Your long, complicated, 300-year-old life. Yes, I'm not frightened of any of it. I know. He pressed his lips to her forehead. That is one of the approximately 10,000 things that make you the most devastating person I have ever encountered in 3 centuries of encountering people. She laughed. It was the first real laugh she had heard from herself and longer than she could track. Myra's going to be insufferable about this, she said. Mira has been insufferable about this since the Spring Council, he said. She started packing her travel bag within 24 hours of that assembly meeting. She has been waiting for exactly this to happen for 6 months. I have been too proud to admit it. You have a very old woman in your life who packs her bags based on the outcome of your romantic life. I have a very old woman in my life who has been right about everything for 200 years and sees no reason to change her approach. Sarah pulled back and looked at him fully, at everything she had been learning to see over 5 impossible days, the rock-hard control and the rain-soft question underneath it, the 3 centuries of loneliness and the single hand pressed to his chest in the dark, the man who had protected her from a distance when he could not protect her from himself. She saw him, and she thought, this is what the warmth in my hands was always moving toward. Not the gift itself. This. I want to stay, she said. With your delegation. With you. She paused. Not because of the bond, because I want to. I want to be there. He looked at her as if she had said something entirely new in a language he was learning. Then stay, he said. 3 months later, when the Autumn Council had long since concluded and the new Alpha of Ironwood had been formally recognized and the blood claim law had been officially removed from the Great Council's code, there was a ceremony. Not the grand kind, with crowds and formal declarations and the political theater of shifting power structures. Those had already happened in their necessary, complicated way. This was smaller. Just a council chamber. Just those who mattered. Just firelight, an old stone, and a man who had spent 3 centuries learning all the wrong lessons about love, finally unlearning them. Sira stood at his side. Not behind him. Not beneath his authority, or deferring to his power, or made small by the proximity to the largest presence in the room. Beside him. The silver light was quiet in her hands, the way it always was now when she was at rest. A warmth, a second heartbeat, the truth of what she had always been and had simply needed the right conditions to become. She wore the formal colors of the Alpha King's court for the first time, and they fit differently than the gray servant's shift she had worn the night all of this began. And the difference was not the fabric or the color. The difference was that she had walked into this room knowing exactly what she was. Cale caught her eye across the chamber. He said nothing. He didn't need to. 300 years of carefully rationed expression had left him with an entire vocabulary of silence, and she had been learning to read it since the first night she watched him press his hand to his chest and look out at a dark courtyard and be alone. He was not alone now. She turned back to the council and stood in the room exactly as large as she truly was, and the silver warmth in her hands moved quietly and steadily like a second pulse. And she thought about all the rooms she had walked into small for all the years she had been made to believe that small was all she could be. She was done with that. She had been done with it, she thought, from the moment she said, "I was hoping it would be you," and the walls started coming down. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. If this story moved you, if you felt every moment of Sira's quiet courage, every heartbeat of the bond Cale spent 3 centuries refusing to name, I would love to know, do you think he was right to suppress the mate bond for as long as he did? Was he protecting her, or was he, as Myra might say, simply afraid? And what would you have done in that council hall, with the silver light in your hands and a man you love standing at your back? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If paranormal romance stories like this one are your world, hit subscribe and stay with us, because there are more stories waiting. More wolves, more kings, more women who were told they were too quiet, too small, too incomplete, right up until the moment they changed everything. Until next time.